present heading, maintain 3,500 till southwest on the localizer. Cleared the ILS 32 approach.
You have to get specific about what you want in the landing. And to do that, we're going to divide every landing into 5 phases. We've got the approach phase. Okay. We have the round out phase. We have the flare. Those are 2 different phases. We have the touchdown and we have the rollout. All right. So let's talk about the approach phase. What you want in the approach phase is to have a stabilized approach. And another thing that I will talk about often is that I prefer to do these power off. People often say to me, well, how do you do it power off if, you're number 2 or number 3? That's pretty simple. You just don't fly the glide path. You see that? You don't fly the glide path from like 3 miles out. Just fly at a certain altitude until you perceive yourself, until you perceive that you will be able to glide to the runway, and then pull power to idle in the final approach segment, the final approach segment. So you can always do that. And the reason you want to get the power out of there there's a couple reasons, but one is you're never going to set the power constant. It's always going to be a little bit different. Every day is a little bit different, depending on how far out you got configured, depending on how high you are. And if you're at 1500, 1600, 1700, 2000, 2200, whatever it is, those are all going to equate to slightly different sight pictures. So you're just making everything slightly more complicated. And you might say, well, does that really matter? And it's like, kind of like when you think back to what I was just saying about Jeremy, where we're trying to burn these pictures in and hear what it sounds like and all of that sort of stuff. It's so much easier to do that if power is at one constant 0 setting. The other reason is because when you finally make the power change, let's say you save it right till the very end, you make the power change here. When you finally make that power change, you're reducing the slipstream over the horizontal stabilizer and the nose will fall a little bit. So the later that happens in the game, the more challenging that will be. There are, by the way, times where you have to land with power, really high density altitudes sometimes, really heavy airplanes, of course. So this is for basic landing skills in a really light airplane like a Cessna 172. All right, so the approach phase, we want a stabilized approach. We're going to have power to idle, not necessarily meaning we glided it all the way around, but power comes to idle, and you want a constant airspeed and a constant rate of descent. Initially, I would go to a really long runway and not worry about where I was going to land. I would work with the student on just figuring out how to identify an aiming point. Just like we were talking about tuning into the airplane and tuning into the sound of the slipstream and the feel of the controls. In this case, we're going to be at a 5,000 foot runway. We're going to get to that final approach segment, and we're going to pull the power to idle. And we're just going to get on target, on airspeed. We can talk about all those things I just mentioned. And then we're going to look out of the window and say, okay, now which point on the runway is the aiming point? Which point on the runway is just fixed in our window? So it's the same, it's just a reference fixed in the window, and all other points will seem to move out from that one point that we are aiming at. That is not the point we're going to touch down, okay, because it is for you guys. Because if you're aiming for a point, when you finally do come in and round out and flare, you're going to float past that point. But if your airspeed's on target, your rate of descent is constant. The only variable in how far you are going to float is whatever headwind exists or doesn't exist. So you've got this sort of one variable to kind of learn to estimate, right? And that's keeping everything very, very simple. Now, we're going to talk about pitching for airspeed and powering to altitude. And I know for some jet pilots, that's counter to the way you would do it. I heard from a French pilot that is absolutely not the way they teach it in Europe. That is okay, because that's down the road. Like if you're a professional pilot, down the road when you're flying a much heavier aircraft, you're going to think about things a little bit differently. But here, we're really trying to burn in the idea, the very basics, the fundamentals, that elevator, that stick, is essentially controlling your angle of attack, right? And the airspeed reacts immediately to those changes. So we want to really tune into the angle of attack, and there's a lot of things that can happen fast in a light airplane if you're not thinking about it that way. If you're thinking about pitching to the aiming point, for example, you can get focused on that and start pitching up to the aiming point and lose speed rapidly, which could be a very dangerous situation. Loss of control is a huge problem. So we're going to think about pitching for airspeed and powering to altitude. And we talked about a power off approach to the runway. Trying to get backwards with you guys. We talked about a power off approach to the runway, but if the aiming point is starting to float up in the windscreen and you are on speed, it's okay to bring in a little bit of power if you have to. That's how we're going to keep that aiming point fixed. This, by the way, is the reason that I would use a long runway to begin with and just give myself plenty of slop, room for slop. That way, we can just work on these skills without having to introduce, a whole lot of, it doesn't have to be so precise. If you go to an airport like San Carlos, where the runway is just under 3,000 feet long and it's very narrow and everything's sort of tight in there, it's a bit harder to get these basics down. All right, in Switzerland, you're being taught for the same. All right, yay for the Swiss. Power idle for a short field landing. Yes, power to idle for a short field. We can talk about that because Jeremy and I worked on that yesterday, but there is a speed. The reason your short field, we'll just talk about that for a second. The reason your short field approach speed, Iceland, is slower than your normal approach speed is because you are behind you're behind the L over D max speed, right? There's more drag than is required. And what you want in a short field landing is to clear some imaginary obstacle. So there's some obstacle here like this. So you need a slower airspeed so that you can have a steeper angle of descent. We're not teaching you to do these stall landings where they come in sort of hanging on the prop and the minute they get over the line, they pull the power and the airplane stalls. That's not what we're teaching you for the private in the United States for a short field landing. We are teaching you that a slower airspeed will give you a steeper angle of descent. Now, the Cessna 172 publishes that speed at 61 knots. If you try that at sea level with two people on board, 61 knots, you're not going to feel what I'm talking about. You have to get the aircraft to about 59 knots, 58 sometimes. But you will feel it if you get it there immediately. And I did this with Jeremy, instruments covered. I said, hey, let's slow down, get just below 60, and boom, you can just feel the bottom fall out. It feels like you're in an elevator. And now, if it starts to get behind that and you start descending too rapidly, power is the way out of that. So you have to reduce your angle of attack, pitch forward a little bit and add power. The reason the speed is slightly slower though is because you're not at maximum gross weight. So if you're trying that at 61 knots and you're not feeling it, you're not feeling that sort of elevator effect where the bottom's falling out and you're descending at that steeper angle, it's because 61 is published for max gross weight. You can do the little V-speed conversion formula. It is the square root of the current weight divided by the gross weight, gives you some multiplier. So like if you're going out at 2,000 pounds instead of 2,500 pounds, you just use a calculator and get the square root of 2,000 divided by 2,500. It gives you some number smaller than 1, like 0.91, 0.89, 0.88, 0.92, whatever it is for the weight. So you take that 0.92, multiply that times 61, and that gives you the speed required, right? For all of your dynamic V-speeds. For more on dynamic V-speeds, get the Ground School app. We talk about it in the instruments and systems section of the knowledge side. Anyway, instruments and systems chapter of the knowledge section. Okay, so that's short field. So the same thing, I would do everything I'm doing here with the normal approach in a short field approach, only you're going to float, like you're not going to float as far. So in practicing these landings, keeping everything constant, power to idle is constant, everything you can constant, you are going to learn to calibrate for yourself. You're going to learn the amount of float you have at a normal approach speed, like 65, and you're going to learn the amount of float you have at a short field approach speed, like 61, or as we said, just under 60. And the headwind then becomes the only variable you have to estimate on the day of the landing. All right. So that's your approach. You have an aiming point. There's one point in the window from which everything is emanating outward. That is your aiming point. Constant airspeed, constant rate of descent. If you're a CFI, you can bring a little dry erase marker and actually circle the aiming point in the window to help pilots see it, help pilots burn it in, what that really looks like. Because it can be hard to see in a big windscreen. All right, now the round out phase, which we are going to think of as separate from the flare, and I'll tell you why in a second, but they are very close together. It's almost like you're going to round out and immediately move into the flare. But the reason I would separate them is the round out is specifically about timing the beginning of the flare. And what you don't want to do is this long sort of blended transition where you sort of turn into a 747 and boop, boop, perfectly put the plane down. You don't want to do that, even though it can work very well in a Cessna 172. It is not a good fundamental skill to have because it will not work in most high performance airplanes like Moonies, Bonanzas, Cirrus, anything that's heavy and fast with a big engine up front. You are inevitably going to judge that wrong someday, and the nose is going to fall through and you're going to slam the nose wheel into the ground or worse, right? So even a 182. So you want to make sure that you keep your nose down, keep your aiming point in the window until you see some point in front of that. I call it the trigger reference point, but some point in front of that, about 100 feet in front of that, you are going to, when that passes underneath your cowling, right? So when that point disappears, you are going to begin the transition to the flare. That's the round out. You're going to round out and immediately move into the flare. And the flare is the process of sort of wringing all the energy out of the wings, right? You are going to think of it as protecting the nose wheel and working to align the aircraft over the center line. In a perfect landing, you will land with the longitudinal axis of the airplane aligned with and over the center line while protecting the nose wheel. You don't need to actually stall the wing, but I would like to hear the stall horn. In a perfect world, I would like to hear, like, as you come in and start that round out, move into the flare, like, eep, boom. Right? You should hear it a little bit. The stall horn activates 5 to 10 knots above the stall. So if you're not hearing the stall horn, you're probably landing too fast with too much energy. Now, you hear me talk a lot about the Lindbergh reference. If you haven't heard me talk about the Lindbergh reference, we just put a whole web page up at learnthefinerpoints.com. So if you go to learnthefinerpoints.com/Lindbergh reference, you can find information there. There's also a video on the YouTube channel. But if you're one of these people that's kind of like trying to see over the nose of the airplane as you flare to hold on to that end of the runway, I might have neglected to mention that. So as you round out and your aiming point becomes meaningless to you now, you transition your eyes to the end of the runway. So now you're looking all the way down the runway using your peripheral vision to judge height. But if you're flaring properly, you're going to lose the end of the runway. You're going to get that nose up so high that you no longer have data there, and you don't want to just be a passenger. I see this so often in early training where people will be flaring and then there's a point where they lose the reference and we're just kind of, we could be drifting sideways or whatever, and they don't know. What you want to do is let your eyes roll to the left so that you're using the corner of the front window. That's the area that I call the Lindbergh reference. You want to look at the Lindbergh reference. You'll get all the data you need there as you flare the aircraft and move into the touchdown. And I will tell you, the touchdown is a tricky thing to sort of master because most landings that don't feel great are not a result of dropping it in from too high an altitude. They're a result of landing crooked, right? Side loading feels really weird. So, and the reality is if you're straight, like perfectly straight down the runway, you can drop a little airplane like this in from a surprisingly high distance and it doesn't feel as bad as a little bit of side loading. So it's important that you understand when you're looking at the Lindbergh reference, what aligned with the runway looks like to you in the pilot seat using that reference. And the exercise that I would do to make sure that you've got that burned in is just I want to say high speed taxis, but let's just say extended taxis all the way down the length of the runway with the nose wheel off the ground. I guess they are kind of high speed. The problem with saying high speed is I don't want you to accidentally take off. So if you're doing this with a CFI, of course, preferably at a towered airport. I think this was published in like 2 videos ago on YouTube where I was doing this with Jeremy. You will go just like 1100 or 1200 RPM is plenty to get the aircraft rolling down the runway. The CFI at this point should really be working the power so that the person flying and practicing this can just focus on pitch, looking at the Lindbergh reference, and using the rudders to stay aligned. And it's just a matter of practice, just burning it in. I've seen this 1,000 times, so I know what it should look like. And you literally just do the length of the runway that way. Do that 3-4 times. Do it, maybe you'll get bored of it after 3 or 4 times. So come back to it a week or 2 later. Do it 3 or 4 more times. Do it until you feel like when you are flying your landings, you're coming in, you know that your approach is stable. You know exactly when to round out. And as you flare and lose the end of the runway as a reference, you can go to the Lindbergh reference and just go right back into that thing you were practicing. What does it look like when I'm aligned with the runway? How high am I? And, you know, and all the other stuff you need. And lastly, when you touch, so that's the touchdown. For the rollout, what I don't want to see you doing is just releasing the yoke. I don't want to see you just give up the airplane, right? You should continue to increase the back pressure until the nose wheel sort of gives up on its own. You should continue to hold the center line, and you should slowly roll in the inputs you need for whatever sort of winds exist. Bring the airplane to a nice gentle stop. Take the first available taxiway that you didn't have to slam on the brakes and screech to get to. Don't manipulate the flaps unless it's a short field landing. Pretty much don't touch anything until the aircraft leaves the runway. Get clear, including your tail, all the way off the runway, clear of the hold short line. Stop for a moment. If you have to, tune in ground control and let them, you know, just listen to them while you go through your after landing checklist and then move on to whatever's next. But there's this concept that we want to fly the airplane all the way to the tie down. And again, it's a common error to have people hit the ground and just sort of like give everything up and maybe screech the brakes, hit the flaps, and start moving on to whatever's next. So you're still a pilot until that aircraft is tied down in the tie down spot, or you're back at the runway, or whatever else.
Look up in the sky, there you are. Look up in the sky, there you are.